All right, now whenever you want to go, you're your own.
Okay, I'm going to try to make this about 30 minutes.
Okay.
So if you...
I've got a timer on here, so
Okay.
I'll give you a little when it's 30.
Make me a pointer.
Okay.
Like...
I tell you what, I'm going to give you a thumb when it's been half. Okay? All right.
Tell me when you're ready.
You go. You're rolling.
Hello, everyone. I'm Beau Greer, and I'm happy to be with you today, and I'm planning to help you in your understanding of God's will from the Old Testament. We will be dealing with a number of dates and a number of facts, and I want to let you know that I'm not using any notes, so grant me just a little liberty here to make some mistakes, but I'll try to be as accurate as I can from memory when I give you the chronology and the time frame that we're dealing with from the Old Testament, and that will be from the creation of God when He created Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden down until we get to the coming of Christ. We will be dealing with approximately 4,000 years, and some of these dates that I'll be using are debatable or where they're critiqued, but they are the best product that we have from a number of different scholarly sources and from theologians who have studied this very thoroughly. And I will be giving you their information regarding these times and dates. And the Bible is a very good source of information regarding the people involved and the events involved and their ages and some of the incidences that occur in their life. I'll be quoting when I make reference to a number of passages of Scripture from the American Standard Version, and we'll try to give you background information as much as I can for the time that we have allotted. We're dealing with a period of about 4,004 years from the creation of God in the Garden of Eden until we get to the time of Christ. We might, for study's sake, divide that into 6 different sections, and this will help us to break down each of the sections in a timeline, and we will be dealing with the events in each one of these sections somewhat separately, even though they will be integrating themselves quite a bit because of the relationship of the characters involved. The first section we will be dealing with will be the time of creation down to the period of the flood, in which Noah was involved in the creation of the ark and the preaching before the flood came, and that period will comprise about 1,656 years. That means that from 4004, subtracting the 1,656 years to the flood, we're looking at a timeline of 2,348 years before Christ, when the events of the flood in Noah's day actually occurred. And we will come back to this a little bit later. The second period of time is from the flood down to Abraham, and this involves 427 years. And that brings us down to the days of Abraham. Abraham was born and lived about middle ways between the creation in 4004 BC until the time of the coming of Christ. And so that would put his age, his birth, at 1921 BC. This third section, or third period of time we will be dealing with, is the period from Abraham to the Exodus in Egypt. That period lasted about 430 years, and that put the period of the Exodus about 1,491 years BC. And that is when Moses came into the picture, and the events regarding Moses were very colorful, and we'll get back to the study of those. The next period of time was a period between the Exodus out of Egypt until the time that the kingdom came with the establishment of Saul as the first king. That period of time lasted about 396 years. And Saul came onto the scene being the first king anointed by Samuel. and that occurred at 1095 BC. Saul was the first king of Israel, and then he and David and Solomon reigned for the next 140 years. And that brings up the next section, which was the period of the kingdom of Israel and the kingdom of Judah. That period lasted for about 508 years. And it was dominated by the kings of the United Kingdom and then the kings of the divided kingdom, which began at the end of Solomon's reign when Rehoboam, Solomon's son, took over the kingship. Then the last section before the coming of Christ was when the children of Israel, rather the children of Judah, were taken off into Babylonian captivity. And that period of time lasted 587 or 86 years prior to the coming of Christ. So you have the 6 divisions of time, and it's pretty easy to, it's much easier at least, to remember those as a period of time separate and apart, because each one deals with a little bit different culture of life and different relationship of God to man, and also a different spiritual relationship in several cases where God gives his laws and decrees later on in the culture and development of the history of man. Let's go back now and look at the first part from creation down to the flood. We have, first of all, Adam and Eve been created by God and placed in the Garden of Eden. The Garden of Eden is thought to have been in the lower Mesopotamian valley, which was comprised of 2 major rivers with several minor tributaries, the Tigris and the Euphrates River. Those rivers run through Mesopotamia and exit ultimately into the northwestern part of the Persian Gulf. It is thought by many that the Garden of Eden was located right at the headwaters of the Tigris and Euphrates River, where they exited into the Persian Gulf. And some ask the question, why can we not find evidence of the Garden of Eden today? The answer to that may be in the fact that, according to geologists and geographic experts and scientists regarding the actual surface of the earth, say that the earth now has been inundated by approximately 200 feet of ocean water. This 200 feet would account for the fact that the Garden of Eden is not visible on the land mass that we presently can see, but is probably under the northwestern part of the Persian Gulf, and we are familiar with where that is, and that may be debatable, but without a better explanation, I'll accept that from my understanding of where the Garden of Eden was. The civilization started very close to that point, and it came when Adam and Eve had 2 sons, Cain and Abel. God told them to make a sacrifice to him. He told them how to make it. He's indicated that they should make it out of the fruit of the flock. And God, from the very beginning of his relationship with man, it seems going back even to the Garden of Eden, it's implied that he had an affinity for blood, and that he wanted the transgressions of man to be made with the sacrifice of animals, which constituted blood sacrifice, which was the life of the animal, and his attitude has been life for life. So if you violate God's law and your life is in jeopardy, as was Adam and Eve's, then in order to buy that back from God or get redemption, then you have to shed the blood of life, and that seems to have occurred beginning with the incidences in the Garden of Eden, as God seemed to make garments out of the animal skins for Adam and Eve, which may have been an indication they used animal sacrifices for their transgressions. Well, after Cain and Abel made their sacrifices, Cain made his out of the fruit of the land. He was a apparently a farmer, and he brought in the fruits of his production out of the land. Abel made his out of the fruit of the flock. He must have been a shepherd. And so God was very pleased with Abel's. He was not pleased at all with Cain's. And there are 2 or 3 reasons involved there. One thing was, and we learned this from the New Testament, in Hebrews chapter 11, verse 4, talks about Abel offering a sacrifice of faith. Well, faith is a confidence in the instructor, or in this case, the lawgiver, which was God, giving the law regarding sacrifice. And he offered his sacrifice by faith. Cain did not. And we read from the 4th verse of Hebrews 11 that Abel offered a sacrifice, and his sacrifice lives on as testimony to faith in God. Cain did not. We read from 1 John, the third chapter, in verse 13, that Abel was an unrighteous man. He did not want to follow God's law. And we see this attested to in his relationship with God in Genesis chapter 4, where he did several things that God did not like. One was he did not follow faith. And we find from the book of Hebrews that it's impossible to please God without faith. So Cain did not offer his sacrifice by faith. He also did not obey God, another violation of God's will. He did not follow instructions, and so he did what he wanted to do rather than what God told him to do. Another thing is he did not follow the law of love, and he did not love his brother. And when God came to him after he had killed Abel and says, "Where's your brother?" He said, "I don't know. Am I my brother's keeper?" And God says, "Your brother's blood cries up from the ground." So Abel was the testimony to God and to his brother's lack of love. His brother did not love him. And God did not like that, because he thought that Cain should have loved his brother and preserved his life. And furthermore, he told a lie regarding the situation about Abel. So all in all, Cain was an evil person, and God did not like that. And so he placed a curse on Cain. And this curse was severe enough that Cain said, "My punishment is greater than I can bear." And also, he said, if people find me, that they will slay me because of the curse that is upon me. And so God made it possible that he would not be slain for his curse, and he marked him to the point that people would know who Cain was, and that way they would avoid accidentally or on purpose slaying him, which was one of his greatest fears. Well, Cain had some children after he killed Abel, and among those children was several generations later was a man named Lamech. Lamech was the first man we read in the Bible that was a polygamist. He had 2 wives. One was named Ada, and the other was named Zilpah. And he had children by both of them. Ada had 2 sons, maybe perhaps others, and 2 of them were named Jabal, and the other was named Jubal. Jabal was the first man that lived in tents and was a rancher or a shepherd man or a herdsman, and he managed cattle. Jubal was the first to take up instrumental music and become a musician. And then Lamech's second wife, Zilpah, had children, and among those was a man named Tubal-Cain, and he was the one that developed metallurgy. He became a forger of iron and brass, and from that time on, we see that these particular industries flourished in the culture of man at this time, and even after the flood, when all of these that lived during Cain's day were destroyed by the flood, which occurred 1,656 years after the creation of man. So we have a quick introduction to some of the main things in life, and that is significant because we all wonder where things come from. How does man know how to do these things? Well, apparently he learned how from the help of God, and God obviously revealed it to those who were creative and worked hard and developed their own trades. Well, let's look now at the events that occurred after much of the life of Cain rides off into the history, and we'll look at the type of people that lived during the days prior to the flood. In the 6th chapter of Genesis, God reveals that mankind had developed themselves into an evil people, and they were corrupt, and every imagination of the thought of their heart was only evil continually. And so God looked around and found a man that was righteous and perfect in his generation. That man's name was Noah. And so he told Noah, said, I'm going to bring an end to all flesh. There's going to be a flood, and I want you to build an ark. And this ark is going to ride the family of mankind through the flood. And he said, this is going to happen in 120 years. Well, at this time, several of the people that had come onto the scene before the flood came were dying out. Adam lived from 4004 for 930 years, and then he died. There was 10 generations between Adam and Noah. I think maybe I can list them. We have Adam, Seth, Enos, Canaan, Mahalalel, Jared, Enoch, Methuselah, Lamech, and Noah. And of these, Jared lived 912 years, which was a pretty long life. He lived almost as long as Adam. And then the next we note was his son, Enoch, and he lived to be 365 years. Well, why did he live such a short life on earth? Well, he was a righteous man, and he walked with God, the scripture says, and God took him. So he didn't get to finish a long life on earth, but he translated him on into heaven, and there's several discussions about what took place there, but we won't deal with that right now. On into the future, we see that Adam lived 930 years, and then Enoch's son, Methuselah, became the oldest man that ever lived. He lived 969 years, and he died the year that the flood came. Did he die in the flood? We don't know. But according to biblical arithmetic, he died the year of the flood. But what is significant to me is that Methuselah lived contemporary with Adam for about 250 years. So if you have any questions about how did Moses get the story of the creation in the Garden of Eden and those events, then you can say, well, Adam may have told Methuselah. He had 250 years to do that before he died. Then Methuselah lived contemporary with Noah, who went through the ark in the flood, and he had plenty of time to get the story from Methuselah, 600 years, and then he could have told Shem, which was at that time 102 years old when the flood came, and he lived to be almost as old as Abraham, living in the life of Abraham for about 170 years or so, 65 or 70 years, contemporary with Abraham. So it would not have been but just 2 or 3 stories from Adam all the way down to Abraham to bring the creation story all the way into the period of the patriarchs. Some other things that are of interest to me is that after, when we get into the period of the flood, there is some questions about 2 things from Genesis chapter 6. First of all, a question arises, and our class asked this question: who are the sons of God? And that's mentioned in the 2nd verse of chapter 6 of Genesis. And my answer is pretty much opinionated, but I will give it anyway. There are basically two major answers to this, and maybe two or three fringe answers. One is that these sons of God may have been, and some think that this is a possibility or the probability, may have been when angels of God came down and intermarried or married with the daughters of men and created a super race of people that we'll call the Nephilim. And that brings up another question. Who are the Nephilim? We'll deal with that in just a minute. But looking further to the sons of God, were they actually angels that had children by the daughters of men, or were they someone else? Well, I find a lot of difficulty in explaining how angels become terrestrial and have the ability to propagate themselves on earth without leaving their angelic identity on the people on earth. We do know that the sons of God, having married the daughters of men, created a super race. They were called the Nephilim, and later on in the books of the Old Testament, they're referred to as the sons of Anak, which we'll get to in just a minute. But my personal belief regarding the sons of God is that these were men that had married the daughters of men that were consecrated by God and were made a part of His special kingdom, which we might call a church or a form of a church. And I get that point from the book of Job. In the book of Job, chapter 1 and verse 4, you hear the statements regarding the sons of God coming together to meet with God, and they apparently had some kind of spiritual convention or revival or some kind of a reporting to God on their life, as they were patriarchs, and God spoke directly to the patriarchs in those days. And so it appears to me that the sons of God more probably were these people that lived back in Job's day. Now we say, well, Job wasn't written till way on later after this occurred. Well, that would not be correct, because I think we could make a strong point for the fact that Job was probably the oldest book of the Old Testament. He lived back in the patriarchal days. He lived back before the laws of God were given to Moses on Mount Sinai, and he also lived in a land that was not highly developed, and and not a whole lot of record remaining from it. So if we took the statements from the Job chapter 1 and verse 6 and also looked into the 38th chapter of Job, verse 7, it further mentions the sons of God, and that they tend to rejoice to God when they are aware that the stars of God sung together, and they rejoiced over that. We also see David mention this in Psalms 89 and verse 7, and he didn't call them the sons of God, but he called them God's mighty men. And so this apparently has to do with this relationship of God's sons meeting and having children by the daughters of men, which were not necessarily godly people apparently, and it tended to reflect adversely on the human race. Then we look at the Nephilim. This seemed to be a race of people that came out of the relationship of the sons of God marrying the daughters of men. And that relationship was mentioned in the 4th verse of chapter 6 of Genesis. And it is noted there, and it's just a little phrase, but it's something important to me, that when the Nephilim were recognized before the flood, it said, and after them. So the term, the Nephilim, recognized by the writer of the book of Genesis, refers to the Nephilim that were before the flood and after the flood. Now there's some interesting discussions about how the genes of the Nephilim came through the flood, but obviously they came through from the daughters or the sons of Noah, and they appeared again back in the days of Moses in the book of Numbers, chapter 13 and verse 33, maybe even 23. And this is a couple of times there in Numbers 13. Then we see them listed again in the book of Joshua when he was going into the land of Canaan to conquer Canaan. We recall the story how the spies that were commissioned out of Kadesh Barnea in the wilderness went into the land of Canaan, and they brought a report back that the people looked like grasshoppers in the sight of those Nephilim. Well, they continued to be in the land, and even when Caleb was 85 years old, he went in, being of the tribe of Judah, he went in and conquered the area of land that was given to the Nephilim, and he drove them out of the country, which was according to God's will. And that, to me, is interesting still further, that in the book of Nehemiah, which was written somewhere around 425 BC, recognizes the fact that the Nephilim had moved up out of the land of the Philistines and come to live near Jerusalem. And the people who came back from the Babylonian captivity under Zerubbabel, under Ezra, and under Nehemiah, with their leadership, recognized the fact that the Nephilim were not happy campers. They did not want to see them there. They had always had a fight with them. They were apparently attached to the Philistine race, and they wanted them out away from the construction of the walls of Jerusalem. So the Nephilim have been in a long time. They were part of God's plan. We don't understand some of his workings, but we do recognize that they serve a need, a place in human history. And probably the most notable Nephilim that history records was Goliath, who seemed to have been a Nephilim because he was a Philistine. He was of giant proportion, and he fought against David, and you recall the victory that was given there against David. So these are some of the events prior to the flood and at the time of the flood, and in our next study we will look at Noah and the building of the ark and the events around the ark, and then the fall of the sons or grandson of Noah, namely Canaan, when he disgraced himself before his father, and God cursed him. And we'll look at some of the generations of the Canaanite nations, and then we'll look on down into the time of the period of the life of Abraham. Thank you for being with me today. I hope you enjoyed the study. I sure enjoyed presenting it to you, and I hope very much that this study will help you answer two questions. The questions are, is God real? And the second question, can I trust the Bible to be true? I'm hoping in this series that we will help you to be able to answer these questions, and that we help you to learn more about your story of God and his relationship with man on your journey to eternity.